Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Program Chair Kevin Wellner and Vice Program Chair Michelle Renee Valladares.
Good afternoon. Welcome. I trust that you're all having a great time. I also hope that as you are soaking in all of these new sessions and new information, that you're finding time and opportunities to engage in deep, rich, generative conversations about how we as researchers can broadly engage and collaborate to find ways, new ways for researchers to educate our diverse democracies. I also hope that you will take all this back to your home institutions and into your own work. Let me begin by thanking some of the people who make this meeting possible. Of course, Felice Levine and the phenomenal AERA staff. And our creative and diligent doctoral students who did so much in planning and helping to put together this annual meeting, particularly the great presidential sessions that you've been able to attend. That's over here. Katie Wiley, Michael Harris, and Anthony Berryman. And of course, all of you, the scholars who came here to share your work in the 2,800 sessions that make up this annual meeting. Let's give yourselves a hand. So, I'm Kevin Wellner, a professor at the School of Education at the University of Colorado Boulder, and I'm here with my colleague, Michelle Renee Valladares. Together we work at the National Education Policy Center, which produces and disseminates research to inform policy discussions. It is our amazing, immense honor to introduce to you our model of public scholarship, the mighty Jeannie Oakes. Jeannie is the inspiration and vision behind this conference and behind an extraordinary body of work. I wish I could adequately convey to you the extreme commitment that Jeannie made to this annual conference. She jumped in and just kept working and working and working. It is amazing. And the rest of us were largely just along for the ride, watching in amazement. Jeannie did, however, make one mistake. She thought it was a good idea for me to introduce her, and in truth, if it were up to me, this whole introduction would, sorry, Jeannie, this whole introduction would be a roast. And right now, you would be listening to fun yet slightly embarrassing anecdotes about Jeannie, perhaps accompanied to the theme music to I Dream of Jeannie. But instead, what I will do is tell you what a joy it has always been to work with Jeannie and to learn from Jeannie. Jeannie's work, wait, hold on, sorry. Do I have this right? Okay. So, Michelle?
When I think of the mighty oaks, I think of the parts you don't see, the roots that go deep under the ground, gathering nutrients and water, and actually physically hold that oak tree up. With Jeannie, her roots were nurtured and grew during the civil rights movement. She came of age in a time where hope was possible and change was almost a reality. That inspiration, that grounding, that commitment to civil rights absolutely defines Jeannie's work. I remember one time, Jeannie and I were traveling home from Sacramento yet again, after having spent a day meeting with elected officials. We were trying to help them get that high-stakes exams, like the California exit exam, the results of those exams were more about inequitable opportunities to learn and systemic racism than they were about the performance of any individual child. I was frankly exhausted. I turned to Jeannie on our little Southwest plane, like that, and I said, how do you keep doing this? How do you make the same point over and over and over again? Aren't there days you just want to give up? Jeannie's response to me? The civil rights movement began a long time before me, Michelle, and hopefully it will continue a long time after me. As a researcher, I might make small changes that I know aren't nearly enough, but I have to remember that my piece is a small, important part of a much larger puzzle. It's that same commitment to civil rights, that same humility, and that same sense of service that Jeannie brings into her work as a public scholar. And you know, she often does it not by standing up on a stage like she will do today, but by sitting down at the table with people from other education sectors, infusing the conversation in so many ways I can't even account, with the best empirical knowledge. And then she does something miraculous. She listens. She listens to them explain the real-world constraints and problems that they face in their position in the education policy debates. And then with them, Jeannie constructs solutions. That's where the power lies. Jeannie takes this approach so much further than most academics I know, by working directly with parents and teachers and community organizers, like she did here in this picture from a meeting we had in South Los Angeles. Jeannie and our team constructed really complicated quantitative data out of the state database and synthesized it into reports that people could understand. There were graphics, there were tables, there were charts, there was language. After explaining, Jeannie stepped back, literally outside of the frame of this picture, and she let the people in the room make sense of the data, understand what the inequality meant to them and their communities, and develop real solutions that would solve them. Kevin?
Thank you. In all of this work, Jeannie's starting point has always been her credibility as a foremost researcher. And that has always been the identity that she has retained. I know Jeannie's work extremely well, but even when I was looking back through that work, found myself in awe at the depth and breadth of her publications and awards. I was actually going to discuss some of those awards with you today, and I found myself so overwhelmed I decided I would just talk about the ones that she didn't win. So there's the Nobel Prize, but I'm still holding out hope for that one. But for Jeannie, it's never been about the awards. It's always been about the work. And so what I want to discuss with you a little bit is how her books, her dozen or so books, have sort of exemplified a progression of thought in Jeannie's work. So we have the groundbreaking keeping track, the evidence and ideas in keeping track. We have the powerful solutions in becoming good American schools. The engagement with communities in learning power, and with teachers in teaching to change the world. We learn from this progression that researchers' career pathways need to have a guiding star, but they also need to be about growth. They need to be about learning from others, learning from those around us. It's about those branches of the mighty oaks. It's about finding new ways to collaborate with new people and new solutions that can be brought forward by us as researchers to improve our society. Let me tell you a little bit about her collaborations. Jeannie has collaborated, of course, many times with teachers and with other researchers, but she's also collaborated many times with policymakers and with journalists and with funders. And she stood along with grassroots community organizers nationwide in their struggle for equitable policies. She's worked with civil rights attorneys as an expert witness on education rights litigation, landmark litigation like Williams versus California. And in all of these roles, Jeannie has exemplified and modeled the core principles of public scholarship, that it's not about taking credit or claiming fame. It's about serving the larger community. Michelle?
No single organization or effort can be led by one person alone. Jeannie would be the first to admit that. But I hope that she and the rest of us can remind her, know that a great leader sets a great role model for all of us to follow. Jeannie's commitment to the field of education research, and more importantly, to educational equity as a whole, is simply unparalleled. Her willingness to create an annual meeting that doesn't disguise that, but rather creates opportunities for each and every one of us to learn how to do that, is an amazing gift. It's been Kevin and my honor to share a little bit about what we know about Jeannie. It's our even greater honor to take you on the next step in our journey together by introducing you to our friend, our mentor, and our colleague, the mighty Jeannie Oakes.
So, you know, who needs a funeral? Thank you, I am blown away. Thank you all so much. So, 100 years old. Well, not me personally, but AERA. It's just quite astonishing. And we should be so proud of how much we've achieved. Over the last 100 years, we've accumulated an enormous body of knowledge, and we've taken our craft to new levels of sophistication. And this is the moment in which we should really celebrate. But it's also a moment of sobering disappointment. Most of us entered this field because we wanted to create an educated democracy that was inclusive and equitable. And for all of our 100 years of trying, we've made such little progress toward being the diverse democracy that we want to be. That's our challenge for our second century of education research. So the challenge is particularly difficult because 100 years of trying has made so clear that traditional approaches of research and traditional ways of disseminating research is simply insufficient to break through the barriers of inequity and exclusion that so mar our democracy. So I will argue today to all of you and try to defend the radical proposition that we need to go public, that decisions about whether our society is equitable and inclusive aren't going to be made by data alone. It's very important to have outstanding research. But the most important decisions get made based on public opinion and public perceptions and by politics. And the best data in the world cannot influence those unless they're part of the public sphere, what John Dewey called the hurly-burly of social policy making. So as I try to defend this argument, I want you to think about three things. One is celebrate. We must celebrate what we've done. But second, consider going public, engaging in the kind of public scholarship that can help move our democracy toward more inclusion and equity. And finally, I want you to think about how you can press all of our institutions, our universities, our school systems, our government agencies, our mayors, our community groups, to embrace public scholarship as a valuable central force in our education research enterprise, to lift it up, to make sure that it is strong, to teach it, to celebrate it, and to reward and recognize it as a high form of scholarship. I think it has enormous payoff, actually. I mean, it seems to me it's the most important work of the 21st century to try to make societies both democratic and diverse. And I think there's an intellectual payoff for us. Engaging in the public sphere, in the messy real world of the most important problems our society faced, will allow us to create better knowledge and, I believe, better research methods for understanding and solving problems. It also that kind of work will put ourselves in a position of being democratic and inclusive. It will prefigure the kind of society we want to have if we engage in this way with publics. So let's go back to the beginning, 100 years ago, when 8 white guys sat at lunch in Cincinnati and cooked up the idea of an education research association. They were determined, along with many of the educated people in our society at that time, that science was be the key to better institutions, not only better technologies, but better social life. And that what we needed to do was to help schools become institutions that would use scientific techniques for betterment. Well, those 8 white guys probably wouldn't recognize much of what they saw today out in the streets, in our schools, and here in AERA. We've changed a lot. We've not only tripled our population and doubled our lifespan, but changed our way of life. In 1916, married women, certainly mothers, didn't work, but lots of children did. The whole idea of a teenager had not even been invented. The average lifespan for a man was 49 years old. About 10% of people owned automobiles. About 15% of homes had telephones and bathtubs with running water. I read that women wash their hair on average about once a month. Very different from today. Today, nearly everybody has a car. Many of us have more than one cell phone, and it's almost impossible to find a house without a bathtub. We have changed a lot. But you know those, here of course, where Google and YouTube and social media have completely transformed our relationship to information and our relationships with each other. You know, much of our civil discourse these days takes place with 140 characters and a hashtag. That's all pretty different. But in fact, schools look quite a lot the same. But we've made some amazing progress in education as well, and there are many changes that those first 8 AERAers would probably not recognize. In 1916, only about 2/3 of the school-age population actually even went to school. Only 10% graduated from high school, and only 10% of adults had college degrees of any kind. Today, almost 40% of Americans have some sort of college degree. It's a huge change in the character of education and the number of people who have formal education in the country. But in fact, there are lots of familiar things, some troubling familiar things that those first AERAers would see. They were asked to help schools deal with the consequences of rapid demographic change that was scaring the traditional white Anglo-Saxon population. They were asked to deal with the consequences of poverty and a changing economy. But in fact, they, like us, responded to the new waves of immigrants in 1916 with enormous fear. The fear of incomprehensible languages. I mean, these were mostly at the time immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe. Incomprehensible languages, unfamiliar religions, what were thought to be radical political ideas, all sent fears and shockwaves through the society. The response was not a good one. Pretty familiar stuff. In 1916, laws, Jim Crow laws, legislated segregation and disenfranchisement. The first year, 1916 was the first year of the Great Migration, where blacks from the South, Latinos from the Southwest moved into northern and eastern cities in hopes of not just a better life, not just a better job, but for freedom. Today, just like they found themselves in 1916 in neighborhoods of racial isolation and concentrated poverty, our cities are much the same. Sure, our laws are no longer explicitly racialized, but in fact, the segregation and disenfranchisement that results from our laws persists. Not so very different. Schools, too, continue to mirror the inequalities and exclusion in the rest of society. Young people in under-resourced urban schools and urban communities are given access to the American dream, which is what people expect our schools to do, with routine didactic instruction and preparation for standardized tests. Immigrant young people are still brought into this society by replacing their home languages with English and being taught a standardized mainstream curriculum. Not so different from 1916. As Jim Banks, our wonderful colleague who I see and former president sitting here, so eloquently reminds us, that people from diverse religious and cultural and ethnic and language groups need to be structurally included in society. They need to feel that their hopes and their dreams are part of the hopes and dreams of the larger society. If not, democracy fractures. Our failure to provide that inclusion and structural inclusion and equality has disastrous consequences for democracy in today's shrinking global world. The alienation and terror and violence we see in Europe and around the world, as well as in the US, are extreme, unconscionable, but in fact understandable consequences of society's perpetuation of inequality and exclusion. We must do better. Well, have we made progress in our schools? Well, we certainly have larger populations of students. We have more diverse populations of students. We have quite advanced education technology. But what we don't have is equity and inclusion. These are the earliest AERAers, and I want to use them as a starting point to talk a bit about our research over the last 100 years and some of the wonderful things we've accomplished and some of the things we've not. I'll then tell you a bit about why I think we're in the circumstances we are. So these AERAers were counters and measurers. They were using school surveys in the belief that if you could amass facts about the state of buildings, about students, about teachers, about curriculum, and assembled those facts in a scientific way, you would not only be able to tell whether schools were good and doing a good job, but those numbers would tell you how to make them more efficient. They thought those numbers would lead to prescriptions that these experts, these fact collectors, these education researchers, could then hand down to educators to administer and conduct teaching and learning in ways that would be more efficient. Now, this first group, the ones on the top, were a little suspicious of academic researchers, and for the first few years, they didn't let university professors join the research association, afraid that they would lead us in directions that were too theoretical and not very practical. But they did actually rely on a lot of their work. In fact, a lot of them were students of some of the famous professors that you see on the bottom of this slide. And they really hoped, for example, that they could take the work of Lewis Terman in sort of inventing the concept of IQ and developing group IQ tests to be able to array students on a normal bell curve of intelligence, divide them neatly into groups, and place them in classes where they could be scientifically targeted with the appropriate instruction for their needs. They thought that E.L. Thorndike's theory of learning as habit, that was acquired through repetition and reinforcement, would provide the basis for a scientific way of teaching that all teachers could then enact in their classes. They thought Thorndike's standardized tests, or his tests of subject matter knowledge, would be wonderful tools to use to measure the progress and the effectiveness of schools. They also thought that Elwood Cubberley there in the middle from Stanford studies of sort of methods of scientific efficiency in industry, sort of looking at assembly lines, time and motion studies, figuring out standardized practices from these analyses of good methods of organizing and practicing would be just the right kind of tools to help school administrators organize and administer their schools effectively. Well, we've come a long, long way. We don't look like those guys anymore, and we don't think like them. Sure, we still do counting and measuring, and we've gotten better and better and better at it over the years. We've developed much more sophisticated measures of student achievement and figured out how to do formative as well as summative assessment. We've developed sophisticated psychometrics and strategies for analyzing large databases. We've created meta-analyses to help us make sense out of large numbers of studies. We've perfected randomized controlled trials in order to grapple with interventions, the effectiveness of interventions, and far, far more. We've made a great deal of progress in counting and measuring. But we've also gone far beyond counting and measuring. First, we've taken a lot of the work that used to be done in laboratories and put it into classrooms and call it design research. We have done an amazing amount of work in moving away from Thorndike's notion about learning as habit toward a multidisciplinary science of learning that draws on everything from neuroscience to anthropology to both understand how people learn and the conditions under which they can all learn very, very well. We've studied factors, both inside schools and outside schools, that affect learning. And in particular, the kinds of factors that create opportunities that help young people of great disadvantage learn well and overcome the harms that they've experienced because of the inequalities in the larger society. We've studied the social, political, historical, economic context of schooling, and we've used critical race theory to understand the centrality of race in the education phenomenon. Most of all, and perhaps most important of all, we've learned that different questions require different theoretical lenses and different methods and different data. So here we are, diverse in the work we do, every bit as much as diverse in the way we look, array on the screen. That's terrific news. Some people would say we haven't made a difference, though. Yeah, that's all well and good, but the work never gets beyond the ivory tower. It's not relevant to the questions that we have as practitioners and policymakers, and in fact, it's just really not made a difference. Well, we have made a difference. Now, not all the differences we might like. I mean, we're responsible for standardized tests. We, and I could probably point to the individuals, invented the idea of standards-based education. We couldn't have test-based accountability without the statistics that we've developed. But our measurement has also enabled civil rights advocates to identify, vest, and concretize important inequalities, and to use our analyses in courts to fight for remedies. Our studies of child development have really informed the press toward preschool as an important element, not just for caring, but for learning, for children's learning, for all children's learning. We've provided research that's helped bolster the cause for breakfast programs for children, lunch programs for children. Our new work on social and emotional learning has provided the basis for anti-bullying programs, and our work has helped identify special supports for children with special needs and identified the importance of inclusion as a strategy for working with students who in the past were closeted away as unteachable. So we have made a difference. But most of the difference we've made, the differences that have stuck, tend to be technical differences. We have made very little headway in changing the fundamental views of intelligence, conceptions of learning, racial stereotypes related to not only intelligence and learning, but all kinds of social and cultural activities. We've studied a lot about these things, but that research has not penetrated. We've also studied a lot and documented the gross inequalities in the tangible opportunities and experiences young people have in school. I mean, that research, many of you have done it, is deep and good and secure, and yet the distribution, the very uneven distribution of opportunities in our school system remain very much the same. Well, I learned this in part from my own experience, kind of learning it the hard way. I started out as a researcher, sort of bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, and was sure that my research on inequality was going to change the world. In 1985, I published Keeping Track. Keeping Track was a report of a set of studies that asked a very simple set of questions. What difference does it make if your school thinks that you're a really smart kid, or you're just an average kid, or you're sort of a struggling, not so smart kid? What difference does that make in terms of the kinds of opportunities you have to learn? You know, the whole theory of doing this ability classification was that we could target instruction to the levels that kids needed. So I wanted to know, what difference did it make for students? What access to knowledge did they have? What kind of learning experiences did they have in their classrooms? What kinds of relationships did they have with their teachers and their peers? Well, the subtitle, How Schools Structure Inequality, says it all. Not only were there dramatic opportunity to learn differences of kids who were thought of as different in their ability and put in different classes, we found distinct racial patterns, with white kids being more often thought of as smart, and kids of color more often being thought of not so smart. A lot of that goes back to those, 8 white guys and their mentors who cemented with their practices the notion of sort of the white elite way of knowing and being is what's defined as smart, and you build structures and provide opportunities accordingly. Well, at the time, I went to the RAND Corporation and I did a number of other studies. I mean, Keeping Track, a lot of people think it was qualitative research. At the heart of that work was a multiple discriminant analyses of a large database from 25 schools of survey data, quantified observation data, qualitative studies of interview data, and the analysis of curriculum materials. It was pretty fancy methodological stuff at the time. At RAND, I took other databases, big NSF databases, analyzed student transcripts, and did some case studies asking the same questions. What is the relationship between tracking and ability grouping, learning opportunities, and race and social class? And the patterns of inequality showed up over and over and over again. Well, the work was well received, and I was kind of surprised by that. You write a book, you hope maybe a few people read it. And I started getting a lot of invitations from researchers, but also a lot of invitations from educators in school systems, from policy groups, from some lawyers, some others who wanted to hear about my work. But what it turned out, while they were very interested in hearing about my work, what they really wanted was advice. What else can we do? And that was a very sobering experience for me, because even though I had done studies and I had a lot of evidence that I felt really confident about patterns of inequality, I didn't have much to tell them. I mean, I had some opinions, but in terms of evidence about what might be done differently, I had a little bit of evidence about mixed ability classes being a little more advantaged in terms of opportunity to learn than lower track classes, but that was about it. So when I went to UCLA, I teamed up with my colleague and friend, Professor Amy Stewart Wells, and we decided to embark on a line of work to answer those questions, so that we would have something sensible to say when people asked us, what else could we do? So we and a number of graduate students, many of whom are here and are now full professors and having amazing careers, set out to do longitudinal case studies of about 20 schools. 20 schools that were experimenting with alternatives to tracking and ability grouping. Now, believe it or not, in the early 1990s, those schools weren't too hard to find. There are a number of schools doing middle school reform, where one of the tenets of the reform was that you have mixed ability classes, you have block scheduling and multidisciplinary curriculum. So here was a great set of schools to start with. There were schools that have joined Ted Sizer's Coalition of Essential Schools. And those schools, too, were trying to move away from tracking practices. And there were a number of activist educators in racially mixed schools who were out there on their own, trying to figure out how to dismantle the structures of inequality. So we studied them. And the results were good news and bad news. The good news was the educators were extraordinarily innovative and able to create opportunity-rich environments that, and also found ways, usually by working together as a team, to provide extra support for kids who needed it and extra challenges for the kids who needed them. The kids seemed to be doing just fine. Teachers were happy, kids were happy with how kids were doing in these classes, and there were dramatic changes at the high school level in the racial participation in challenging it and advanced courses. That was all terrific. The bad news was that in each of these schools, or nearly all of them, the reforms were slowed down and sometimes stopped short as they ran smack into, guess what? Long-standing, deeply held beliefs and assumptions about intelligence. Some kids have it, some kids don't. It's stuff in your head. There's nothing we can really do about it. It's sort of fixed over time. So why would you want to mix them up? They ran into fears about racial mixing. What might happen to white children if there were too many kids of color in their class? Maybe because Amy and I are nice white ladies, people were willing to tell us this in quite open ways often. And we ran into a politics of what we call comparative advantage, the struggle by powerful forces, groups in the school who wanted to keep the tracking system the way it was because in fact it provided real advantages to their top track kids, and these were advantages they did not want to lose. Now, in some ways it's understandable that parents would fight for what's best for their own children. But it had an incredibly distorting impact on the ability to sustain these reforms. Now, we're not the only ones who found this. Many of you have not only documented structures and practices in schools that create inequality, many of you have also documented the positive effects of strategies like school integration, of bilingual education, of culturally responsive and student-focused curriculum, of extra time for teaching, of providing extra social and health supports to children who are harmed by social factors outside of school that interfere with learning. We have a lot of great data about that, but like Amy and me, most of you have also witnessed that these strategies that you've studied are either not adopted at all, adopted and very weakly implemented, and few of them can be sustained over time. Well, what we concluded from this probably should not have felt like rocket science to us, but it did. That in fact, inequality and exclusion are not engineering problems that simply need evidence and experts to create fixes for and put them into schools. These things are driven by politics and by public perceptions. And for all the wonderful journal articles and books and tenure and promotion that the whole group of us got out of this work, we were not denting those factors that kept the inequalities in place. Well, the story goes on. About the same time, I started getting lots of calls from lawyers. I mean, this was sort of in the mid-90s. A lot of school districts that were under court-ordered desegregation were eager to get out from those court orders. And they'd gone back to court and said, we're now unitary, we're desegregated, lift our court orders, we've solved the problem. And the lawyers called me and said, we have a suspicion that some of these districts are using tracking and grouping within schools to resegregate kids inside schools, even though they have desegregated buildings. And a couple of the districts actually had, as part of their court orders, the requirement that they not do tracking and ability grouping to avoid that resegregation. And the lawyers wanted also to know how that was going. Now, I was very lucky at the time because Kevin Wellner, who you met earlier, had given up his legal career and become an education researcher. And the two of us jumped into this work thinking that we would be able to discover whether legal mandates might help provide some of the muscle that these equity reforms needed. Well, again, we found good news and bad news. In fact, we found the same patterns of tracking and inequality and racial bias in student placements that we had seen in earlier work. And we also found, even with these court orders, belief systems and politics that worked against both desegregation and detracking. But not all of the schools or systems were alike, and some were doing much better than others. And one school system, in fact, was completely constrained. They could do nothing. These educators, even the ones who wanted to do this reform, and believe me, not all of them did, felt that they were absolutely unsupported by their communities and were just frozen, unable to make any of those changes or make them in any deep way. There was another district, however, where the superintendent and the school board took on this issue as a moral crusade. They said publicly to everyone who would listen, this is the right thing to do, we would do it whether or not we had a court order, although it helped them a lot that they had a court order. The local newspaper had some journalists that were very interested in this and wrote supportive articles. There were some activists, grassroots, and civil rights groups in the community that marshaled a lot of community activism, including marshaling the engagement of a lot of the parents whose kids were being benefited by the desegregation and detracking reforms, and it made a difference. It was not perfect, it was not all smooth, but over time, the district became a model of a district that provided challenging college preparatory curriculum for all of its children. So Kevin and I theorized about this and tried to figure out what was going on and came up with the concept of a zone of mediation. And that was that in each community, there is a zone in which it's acceptable to propose and think over particular ideas and reforms. And then there's a zone of things that are just unthinkable. And that zone is shaped by large social forces, but also shaped by the actions of local actors. So that local actors engaged could, and those outside of school in particular, could push that zone, nudge it over a bit so ideas and strategies that were previously unthinkable could be considered. So we thought, oh boy, now we really have a lot of great knowledge. We can document the inequalities. We have some evidence of successful practices. And now we have some evidence that can help implementation. Let's write more books, more articles. Let's, put them in academic places. More students wrote dissertations, and all was good. In fact, of course, it wasn't. So about that time, I teamed up with John Rogers at UCLA. I'm very good at picking colleagues, I can tell you that. John is a Dewey Scholar, and the two of us cooked up this idea called UCLA's IDEA, Institute for Democracy, Education, and Access. And our theory, our question was, if researchers partnered with community activists, with teachers and other educators, with lawyers and legal advocates and others, could we together push that zone using data and evidence as one of the tools that activists who were seeking equity and inclusion could use. So our role was to sort of shine light through data on some of the issues they cared about. We worked in California and in Los Angeles in particular, to do analyses of state and local databases in response to questions they had, such as, how are qualified teachers distributed in this neighborhood or this community, and to write not just academic reports, but to develop infographics, to develop little policy briefs, to develop reports by school districts and legislative districts in the state that sort of showed the extent, what was going on in those particular places. I mean, we also wrote books and dissertations and journal articles, but we saw that together, that activity, the partners, I want to say our partners, they had roles too. This was a really distributed expertise kind of model. And what they did was powerful storytelling and testimony about their own experiences. And they had all kinds of strategies for putting political pressure on both the officials who could make better decisions and on the people who could influence the officials who could make better decisions. And that was their role. They were also our research partners, and some of the people in this picture are actually in this room tonight, and many of them have presented their research at AERA in the past. We felt we shifted the zone. California, in part, has become a more hospitable place because people throughout the state have had access to research partners, not only us, but others in California, who've partnered in a way that the evidence of both about the problems and potential solutions has become part of the water supply. We think we helped a bit shift that zone. Of course, IDEA did not invent this form of public scholarship. This, in fact, is a tradition as old as those other 8 white guys that I talked about beginning. 100 years ago, John Dewey wrote Democracy and Education. We're also celebrating that centennial. And Dewey argued throughout his career that the way to social betterment, the way to democratic society, certainly involves intellectuals, but not intellectuals as experts who develop prescriptions and then hand them down to be enacted in society, but as intellectuals who engage in the messy problems that need to be solved and with the people who suffer most from those problems. He talked about the role of scholars in creating publics, for helping to show that problems that might be thought of as personal troubles were actually concrete problems that resulted from policies and structures in the larger society. He felt scholars should teach methods of inquiry and use those methods of inquiry together with publics in order that they could discover and understand the problems better, experiment with solutions, and even use their data, their knowledge, to hold the state accountable for solving problems. Dewey thought that scholars could work together with artists and with others in the community to begin to tell stories out of what they've learned that would begin to create a sense of community and a common will to solve problems on behalf of the public good. And Dewey's colleagues, Jane Addams and W.E.B. Du Bois, who were close to him in many ways, pushed him even farther. They said, unless we include those who've been pushed most to the margins, women, poor people, people of color, immigrants, in the process of social inquiry, we will never have the knowledge we need in order to solve those problems. Du Bois talked eloquently about only the sufferer understands the suffering. Intellectuals cannot speak for them, but they have a special responsibility to seek them out and make their voices a part of the inquiry and conversation and discussion, debates about how to solve our problems. Throughout the last 100 years, we've had a lot of social scientists who stepped out and gone public. This is a picture of Kenneth Clark, who he and his wife Mamie did these famous psychological studies of children's preferences of dolls. And working together with partners with the NAACP, they turned their findings into such compelling testimony in the Briggs case, which was one of the cases that got consolidated into Brown v. Board of Education. It was so compelling that it's cited in a footnote of the Supreme Court's decision in Brown. It's an amazing, amazing accomplishment for the scholar. Now he took heat for it. You know, is this advocacy rather than research? Right? Many of us have heard this question. But in fact, 20 years later, he was voted to be president of the American Psychological Association and had a very esteemed and respected career as a psychologist. In the last 25 years, a number of people have stepped out, probably most famously Cornel West, the philosopher, who started hard to believe when you know his persona, but argued that being a public intellectual was not about being famous. It was about work that has a public consequence. Ernest Boyer, one of the most esteemed leaders of higher education in the 1990s, argued strongly that a scholarship of engagement should be on par with traditional forms of scholarship and rewarded and celebrated in our institutions. And Michael Burawoy, in 2004, the president of the American Sociological Association, called for a public sociology, very much like Dewey had called for, not to abandon traditional research, but to augment the field, to have a central place for work engaged in and partnering with those grappling with the most profound social problems. AERA has not been silent either. Maxine Green argued very strongly that researchers ought to pay attention to the normative parts of the education enterprise as well as the empirical. Ann Lieberman and Alan Schoenfeld argued very strongly for the close interaction of research and practice. And just 4 years ago, Arnitha Ball talked about, her theme was, knowing is not enough, pushing us to do. So here we are. What does this mean? The definition of public scholarship is evolving and changing, being constructed, including being constructed this week at this meeting. There are some essential elements. One is research of translation, the obligation to make our work accessible and understandable and useful to those who need it as they solve problems. A second is engagement, that this is not an ivory tower exercise, that it means being in the real world, in the mess of the problems we face, and working closely with those who are engaged in those problems. This is not just about doing good. This is about better scholarship. In fact, one of the things I think we need to most keep in mind, that doing public scholarship does not mean that researchers turn into Superman and go swooping into these helpless communities, rescuing them from their problems. It's about partnership and reciprocity, knowing that the learning goes two ways, and it's from those two-way relationships that we gain social betterment. So in order to provide a foundation for where I think we need to go in our next century, we really designed this AERA meeting to just give us a little kickstart into a century of public scholarship. One of the things we did, and you might have participated in it, was about a year ago, we did a crowdsourcing activity where we asked all the AERA members to send us ideas and evidence that were well-grounded, well-researched, that should be in the public sphere, that should be part of the political debate, but are not. And you did. And we sifted through all of that material, and we found 32 incredible scholars who were willing to step outside their comfortable roles as academics and venture into public scholarship with us. We took them away for an intensive, sort of felt like boot camp retreat, where they got trained by a communications team and developed the body of work, the essential findings of their many years of work into 6-minute talks that they presented with 3 slides and no notes. You can see I'm trying to do this myself. We took them to Washington, where we had a 3-day conference, a 2-day conference, where they interacted with 32 high-level policy influencers, including the heads of major legal advocacy groups, staffers from the Hill, heads of foundations, people in government agencies that oversee science, and just to see, how would this go? They presented their talks, and we engaged in conversation. Let me show you some pictures. And it was exhilarating. The quality of the conversation was amazing. And we left convinced that this was certainly one way of helping to share research so it could be heard, but also so that the people who are in a position to influence communities and policies and states and how philanthropies spend money see us, education researchers, as friendly, accessible, interesting people that they might just call up on the phone and have a continuing relationship. Because one little 6-minute talk won't do it. In fact, what it did is raise all kinds of questions. Now, we had the second day of the meeting was at the White House. The White House sponsored a research into policy event, and we engaged with federal officials who too said, this is exactly what we need, and I've never seen so many business cards being exchanged. It was very exciting. Now, 20 of those talks are being presented in 5 sessions here at this meeting. There were 2 yesterday, and if I say so myself, they were amazing. These scholars are incredibly interesting. And again, they provoked really rich and wonderful discussion. There are 2 tomorrow, and there's another one on Tuesday. I hope you get a chance to see them. But we also have all kinds of public scholarship all over this meeting. It's been amazing when we put out a call for people who wanted to do sessions on public scholarship. We were able to array a large number of sessions. Some talk about communicating research to broader audiences, all the way from traditional media like books and articles to using social media, film. We have some that are about collaborations between groups trying to affect policy and researchers, legal groups, state agencies, groups of school districts, community organizations, working together with researchers around policy issues. We have a group of sessions about research practice partnerships. People taking on the extraordinarily difficult task of asking and answering questions together that both help improve the immediate situation they're in, but also provide credible knowledge that can be used more generally. We have examples of universities, centers, and partnerships where institutions have been willing to leverage their political capital, their finance capital, to have partnerships around public scholarship to solve problems in their immediate areas. And we have several sessions that create publics. Researchers coming together, mostly with members of organizations working on social movement issues like Black Lives Matter and Black Girls Matter and opting out of tests and illegal immigration and some of the most cutting edge issues in our society. So enjoy those sessions and learn from them. So I'll close by saying, here we are, 25,000 of us, very diverse and very committed. We've got 100 years of wonderful work to celebrate, and we have a century ahead where I really hope you'll join me in going public. in doing public scholarship to help to shift those norms in politics that so constrain our best efforts. I also want you to push your institutions, as I've tried to push mine, to celebrate, reward, lift up. This is not service. This is not just stuff for clinical faculty. It is stuff for clinical faculty, but it is scholarship of the highest order that we need to lift up, to strengthen, to celebrate, and to reward. And we need to do this because it is the most important work of the 21st century to help make societies both democratic and diverse. As I said at the very beginning, I think if you work this way, you'll find that you produce better knowledge, and you also find that you're living a life that prefigures the society we want to see, working in partnership with others for the collective public good. What better way to live your life? Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. See, and I did have my notes here just in case, but I want to thank you so much again. I want to say that it's been such a privilege and such an honor and such a good time to have a chance to lead this passionate, wonderful community of education researchers. I cannot thank you enough for the privilege of having this role over the last year. I also want to thank, of course, Kevin and Michelle and Katie and Anthony and Michael and Felice and the whole AERA team who just did a fabulous job of helping us pull off this. And whenever I had a crazy idea and I was afraid to call Felice and ask her, I called her, mustered my courage, and she said, "Yeah, we can do that." And then, of course, she helped make it happen, which was terrific. I also want to thank my wonderful, supportive husband, Martin Lipton. You probably saw his name all over the publications because he's actually a co-author as well as a husband, and my wonderful family. 2 of my daughters are here, but I have 2 sons, and they all have wonderful spouses, and we have 6 amazing grandchildren, and they are enormously tolerant of my inability to think about anything else. So now it's my pleasure, my real pleasure, to hand off to the wonderful Professor Vivian Gazdan the gavel, knowing that she will continue this good work and help us really turn the page into our next 100 years. There you are, right here.
It's fabulous. Thank you, Jeannie, for that incredible talk, that incredibly stimulating talk. We are deeply motivated to move forward. I look out at all of our AERA members, and I want to tell you how much I'm looking forward to working with you as we move toward the theme, knowledge to action, achieving the promise of equal educational opportunity for the 2017 meeting. My very first AERA was here in Washington, and the meeting has not been here since that time. I don't know if I had anything to do with that or not, but I am so thrilled to take on this responsibility and in Washington, D.C. And I want to thank those of you, even at this early point, who have offered me such goodwill and support. And so I'm going to look forward along with the co-chairs James Earl Davis from Temple University and Angela Arzubiaga from Arizona State University. We're going to look forward to seeing you in San Antonio with its incredible history, rich history of diversity. We're going to move forward. We're going to achieve the possibilities that are before us. So toward 2017.